What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and typically I'm critically analyzing apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. But today we have another interview, and Matthew and Jaren, Jaren, fuck, Aaron with the J. Jaren, they are authors of a book called Christ Before Jesus, where they take a little bit different direction to the mythicist conclusion than I do in particular. And so I'm very curious. I have some pushback to some of the things that they talk about in their book, but I'm very much up for, people expanding their horizons and looking into all the possible explanations and everything like that. So I meant to put y'all's book link in the description, but I will definitely get that in there as we go through the interview. But I just, kind of want to start off with, having y'all sort of not play yourselves up, talk yourselves up, and sort of shield for yourselves a little bit. If each one of you can sort of, tell people about yourselves, where they can find you and everything like that, that'd be great.
Sure. Matthew, go ahead.
All right. So I am the co-author of Christ Before Jesus. Always got to have that book on hand to shill. Jared and I have grown up together. Kind of started looking into this topic again after, if you want to talk about our history, we both grew up in a Southern Baptist church. I looked into it again recently and kind of got to a standstill on some things. And we're like, it'd be great if we had something more objective to look at than just testimony from old church fathers from like 1800 years ago about, when this stuff was written and things like that. We ended up finding a program called Stylo, which is run on our studio from our programming, for those who know what that is. And it does stylometric analysis on the New Testament text. It really can do it on any text, but we focused on New Testament texts and early Christian texts. And we ended up finding some really interesting stuff, which is what led it into Christ Before Jesus, our book. Jaron?
Yeah. So we not only came out with a book back on, I believe it came out on Amazon on the 4th of March. So we're right on the cusp of about 6 months there of it being out. On top of that, we do a bunch of TikTok lives there on TikTok. It's TikTok, whatever.com, I guess, / Christ Before Jesus, or at Christ Before Jesus. And you can definitely find us on there doing lives every other day or so, just kind of a Q&A there with the authors. Usually it's me, but every once in a while it would be me joined by Matthew. And those are really special treats because that way you can kind of ask any questions that you have. And some people kind of view it as, oh, hey, you guys are just selling a book. No, we are very happy to get into the information there, obviously on TikTok for free. So very easy access to the authors of the text.
Awesome. And just so everybody knows, I do have the link in the description right now. So if y'all are interested in today's talk and what they're saying, you can hit up that link down below, and you can go directly there. And I use my own link shortener type thing, so I will know how many of you push that link right there. Click the link. I'll be able to let them know too. So, but anyways, all right. So I am also a mythicist, and so I'm very interested in this conversation. And I was very surprised because, when I started listening to your book, because I have this idea that I got dyslexia. It's really hard for me to read sometimes. So like listening to it, very helpful. I'm glad that you both actually voiced the audiobook for it, which we've actually recorded an audiobook, for Richard Carrier. And I have to say, it's a hell of a process to get it like recorded and edited and everything like that. Like, it's just crazy. But anyway, so I've been listening to it, and at first I was like, this seems a little sus, but come to find out that there is there are scholars that are being published like in major journals and from major institutions that are actually positing some of the things that y'all are saying. So I was pleasantly surprised for that. I do really like the ability of a field to peruse different ideas in this way. And I feel like biblical studies has really kind of stagnated and has been controlled by a large population in the biblical studies place in the field. My first question is, like, what are y'all's backgrounds? Like, what made, I guess, what played into you, looking into this, and what is y'all, how does y'all's background sort of relate to your conclusions?
I'll take the I'll go first here on this one. So as Matthew mentioned, we've known each other since we were, I think I was 10 and 11. He was 11 when we met, and we attended a Southern Baptist church. I served a bunch of different missions, going to different states, different countries. I believe I was on either 7 or 8. If I sit and remember, I could figure out how many. So I was definitely very involved within.
I wasn't.
Yeah, but I was definitely involved within Christianity. Evangelical type Christianity, and I guess I had more or less deconstructed, away from my faith about maybe 10, 11 years ago, roughly about that time. But I continued on assuming that Jesus was probably just a real figure, and assuming that more or less just a teacher that was going around in the first century just got some fanatics that just exaggerated a lot of the claims and deified the person, put some supernatural claims onto him. So when we first started looking into this, it was coming at it from the approach of why. So just trying to figure out why the Christians had taken that person and put claims onto him, and when they did it and whatnot. But we very much assumed that Jesus was a real person, and slowly but surely we started to find a lack of evidence, and then things started to move later as far as the dates go. And again, once we found the stylometric analysis, it just kind of hardened those particular positions for us.
Yeah, and in terms of educational background, I've got a master's degree in public administration. My bachelor's was in philosophy and religious studies. So there was always interest. I was definitely not as active in the church as Jaron was. At all. But yeah, I would definitely agree with him. We definitely thought, Paul was a real person who wrote at least 7 letters that, the scholars generally agree were written by the same person that they call Paul. And that there was a historical figure behind the movement. And I guess we assume, Peter and all the other, or most of the other, at least, apostles were real people. And we found more and more information that seemed to stack up against that. And that's when we looked into this software, because we wanted to be able to look at the text from a less biased perspective, because there's so much just culturally that goes into any of the New Testament texts when you read them straight, as is. Just because we grew up, even if you're not religious and never were religious, you grew up in this predominantly Christian culture that you kind of read things into it. When you think of the name Jesus, you probably have an image in your head, as opposed to the people, whenever they first read these texts, wrote these texts, they probably didn't have an image of him in their head exactly the same way we would.
Yeah. And I would tack onto that by saying, hey, we are not, or at least we try not to be, conspiracy theorists or anything like that. I know that there are some people within the field of mythicism that do kind of espouse a lot of those conspiratorial kind of beliefs, especially towards the creation of Christianity or Jesus. And we definitely, I would say, vehemently oppose any kind of concept of a conspiracy behind Christianity or Jesus. That being said, when you listen to our points, when you read our book, or in your particular case, listen to our book, it can sound kind of like that, because there's a lot of details that we have to get into. And I guess a lot of people would like for it to be simpler and just be like, hey, why didn't Jesus exist? Show me the proof that this person didn't exist. And they're wanting something that can be summed up in like a sentence or maybe 30 seconds or a minute or something. And it's like, well, there's a lot of layers that you have to peel back. It's 1,800 years worth of dogma and excuses and revisionism and whitewashing. And so it can be tough. So there are parts of the book that get pretty heavy with dates and names and places and everything like that. But I mean, if you get through it, not only props to you, but on top of that, just, you'll start to see why exactly we have to get into that level of detail.
Yeah, and I totally agree about that. Of course, I listened and read my way through both Proving History and On the Historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier, which are like pretty hefty books. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that y'all's book is about 8 hours long on Audible. Which is a pretty reasonable runtime, like for a book. It's a lot less than, or not, sorry, not a lot less. It's a lot more than a lot of the books that I've listened to on there. So I come at this from I guess maybe not a data centric side of it. Like I say data in like because I know Jaron. Got it, Jaron. When you because I've been on your TikTok lives, which I love, by the way. I love that you're interacting with people on this topic, even if we come at it from a different perspective.
Right.
I love that you're actually interacting with a lot of people on there. You too, Matthew. I know that you have less bandwidth for it, but you too. I know that you talk about how you're a data scientist and that's how you kind of come at it. What's the data scientist part? As an engineer, I'm very curious as to all of that. And I know that you've got this stylistic formula that you're using. I'm more used to the Bayesian method for analyzing this kind of stuff. I'm wondering if you can kind of go into that a little bit as far as how you build your position and how that relates to the data science part.
Oh yeah. So go ahead.
No, you can go for it. Yeah.
Well, just something really basic from me before Matthew gets into more of the details, I guess, on it, because he definitely is someone who really enjoys going into the details there on that. I would say, I hope. But yeah, so stellometry in specific is what we've focused on primarily. So stellometry, just as an example, it's a literary analysis that's been around since the 1800s. It's using math. It's not AI. It's not machine learning. It's not that kind of stuff. But it's using math to attribute authorship. The easiest example that I always go to is if you write a text and I write a text, stellometry would be able to tell us that that's two separate authors. It's had some pretty popular success and kind of cool examples here recently with J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling wrote under a pseudonym, Robert Galbraith, and readers were able to find that Robert Galbraith was actually J.K. Rowling, that using stellometry, and they got the publisher to admit to that. So it's got some pretty cool uses here recently. Even, not to get political or anything, but Trump in specific, he tweets so much that we're able to use stellometry to determine if it's him tweeting or if it's possibly a staff, one of his staff members. So it even gets used in courts. Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to ask because I remember like any, I guess, person, I love watching like the I want to say it's like a docudrama type true crime sort of TV shows. One of those was about the Unabomber, and one of the interesting things that I noticed about the Unabomber case was that like one of the lead FBI agents on it kind of developed this method for using the Unabomber's words to determine exactly like where he went to school, where he lives, and all this other stuff. Is it something similar to that, like determining, like using a linguistic sort of approach to determine like whether or not one person wrote multiple different things?
Yeah.
If you have enough data, yeah, I would say that that's possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So specifically what we look at isn't specific vocabulary or technical vocabulary. This is looking at the most frequent words that we use And across most languages, those are going to be your function words and articles, things like that. It, the, a, and, me, I, things like that. Those are used at a certain frequency in the way I talk and the way I write that is different from you and is different from Jaron and is different from other people. And people from different backgrounds are going to use that differently. We did a just a fun study, which is outside of this book, but we got messages on Facebook Messenger between Jaron, myself, and another friend, and then also just like books from 200 years ago in English. And we ran it against all that together, and it had over 90% accuracy on picking out which ones were me, which ones were Jaron, which ones were the other people. And the way we do it, we think that we have over 96% accuracy when it comes to Greek, and especially biblical Greek and Greek of that era. So we first, when we built it out, we did a test kit. We did multiple tests with this test kit, over 100 Greek texts. And once we got a methodology that would actually accurately identify these texts, at least to 96% or so is where we tended to get it. And that's what the literature says, 96 to 98% for certain sample sizes. We can get all these details later. So that's what we use in the New Testament. I think where we get a bit more novel with our usage of this is that in the past, when people look at this, they look at whole text. So they look at the Gospel of Luke altogether. They look at the Gospel of Matthew altogether, and all of First Corinthians by itself, and then Romans, and so on and so on. And what we do is we break it down at the chapter level, or a chapter or two, depending on the size of the chapters, which gives you a very different look at how the New Testament was written and who these authors are and things like that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Just to kind of piggyback what he said there, or on what he said, it's our approach in specific, our contribution to mythicism is looking at this with stellometry at the chapter level, which just really hasn't been done yet. I haven't found any particular case where anybody has broken down the New Testament in Greek to the chapter level and compared it with other texts like we have from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century CE and the 1st century BCE in Greek. We did find one particular case where they used stellometry, but they used entire books, and then they threw in, I believe it was Clement of Alexandria as a control. And Clement of Alexandria was so late that he had nothing to do with the New Testament. So they obviously it worked pretty well as a control. But had they picked anybody from the 2nd century, I feel like it would have been a different story. But that being said, again, we've chopped it into chapters. And even at the chapter level, we can still find that level of accuracy. The scholars behind the software Stylo that we use have actually come out here within the last about year and a half or so. They've come out and said that the amount of data that you need in order to achieve these accurate results is a lot less than previously thought. And the amount that they said was roughly about the same size as the average chapter in the New Testament. So as a result, we know that in the past, people probably would have been a little scared, not scared, but slow to use chapters in their study because there was just no proof that it worked per se. The scholars behind like Stylo just wouldn't have.
And I'd also say that part of that is also the fact that it was just way harder to do it a few years ago before this software came out, because back then, even if you were doing it by computer, you'd have to code in, the formula and all of that, and you'd have to put in your data sets each time. All this is more or less you're dropping down and selecting which folder you want it to look at, and the folder has all your texts, and then which formula you want to run on and a few other details, and it's got a graphical user interface, and it just makes it so much easier that I can run a test in about 3 to 5 minutes, if I already have the text available. But somebody who was doing this 10-20 years ago is probably going to have to go through and count each word by hand and make a graph or like a spreadsheet or something. And so it's just way easier for us to take that risk of like, well, let's see what it looks like at the chapter level, as opposed to, well, it may not work anyway, so let's not even try it, or like it may not show anything interesting, so why try it? But we're at this point where the technology is available for us to do that easily.
And not only that, but we explained in our book how anybody else could do it. We literally say, this is where to get the software. It's free. It's open source. We explain how to open it up and install it and run it. Like, we're trying to encourage people to see it for themselves. Really quick, I know it's kind of a random kind of anecdote, but when I was younger, when I was a kid, I remember hearing some of the more conservative Christian people that I grew up around. I was homeschooled as a kid, so yeah. But anyways, some of the people that I was hanging out with, I remember someone told me that they didn't believe that dinosaurs existed. And I looked at them like, what are you talking about? Of course they existed. And they said, no, they didn't. Have you ever seen a bone? And I said, yeah, we see them all the time in museums. And they said, no, that's actually just plaster. It's not the actual bone. And they went off on some particular thing about how they never, or I never saw specifically a bone. And I just thought that was just the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. But nevertheless, there are people out there that believe that. So we wanted to make sure that people didn't just take our word for this, that they were able to go and replicate these results on their own. And if they find it's wrong, then prove us wrong. That's perfectly fine. But if you can replicate the results in your own home and you can see it, there you go. I mean, it's not something that we just want to pull the wool over people's eyes with or something.
Right. So this particular formula, or this software, can determine if texts are written by the same person, but obviously that's only as far as it gets you. Like, it doesn't tell you whether or not like that person existed. So I'm kind of curious, how does this factor into the mythicist position?
Okay, I'll tackle that, Jared. So, and we'll get into this in a bit more detail, but first off, we can talk about Paul. Scholars have known for a long time that, especially the pastoral epistles, which are First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus, were not written by the same person that wrote the rest. And there are only 7 that they generally attribute to this Paul figure. So when we look at it, we're able to see if that's true or not. And if it's not true, then every letter you take away from Paul, even the ones that aren't authentic, that takes away a little bit of biographical information about him, because each one has a little bit of info. And the way we get it, we whittle it down to a point where there's very little, and we can talk about that in a bit. And then, probably more importantly, we can look at the Gospels. And the reason the Gospels are important is because right now, people generally date Mark to 70 to 80 or so, somewhere in that range. Sometimes they'll say 67 to 70 or something. But it's right after the fall of Jerusalem in the first Roman-Jewish War. When we look at the Gospel of Luke, we're actually able to tell that a certain claim that was made at the end of the 2nd century about the authorship of the text is either true or false. And it turns out that Luke looks like it was written in the 130s to 140s. And if that's the case, then, the others would probably be around that time. We know that John looks like it was reliant, at least in part, on parts of Luke. Matthew seems to be in response to some aspects of this, I guess you could call it proto-gospel, but at the time it was probably the first gospel written in the 130s or 140s, because the claim is that Marcion of Sinope wrote the first gospel, and that was his claim, and that later Christians added the first 3 or 4 chapters of Luke and the last chapter of Luke and other content in there around the year 144. He either wrote it or published it. That part's a bit disputed and not clear. The heresiologists, especially Irenaeus, said that no, actually Marcion cut those chapters out. And so what we're able to see is that when we look at a chapter level, where we would be able to tell, did the same person write all of that text? And then that would make Irenaeus's claim true. And that would mean that the text was older than Marcion when it was published. And so it would date back prior to 144. Or is it actually the case where those first chapters were added by later Christians? And it turns out those first 3 or 4 chapters were added by later Christians. And the first claim about the authorship of that gospel, or at least the core content, is dated to the 130s or the 140s. And that turns out to also line up with the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we can get in. And we get into how Mark 13, which is used to date Mark to the Jewish-Roman War in the 1st century, that's actually very likely to be about the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s, and then so that pushes pretty much all the gospel material into the 130s, 140s, and later. And then at that point, to tie that back into mythicism, if you're not just looking at the first gospel story written 30 years or so, or 60 or so years after Jesus, you're looking at 100+ years before you get the first written story about Jesus.
Not only that, but we see the evolution of the religion, because the earliest attestation to the Christians that seems reliable, and to be fair, the attestation is from Pliny the Younger, and there's already some questions using stellometry. There's already some questionable material there. But if it's authentic, the first attestation to the Christians would be from Pliny the Younger in 111. And he doesn't mention anything about them that's in connection to Judaism, to Judea, any Jewish man that they worship. He doesn't even say that it's a man, doesn't say the name Jesus, just connects them with a Christ figure. And so over time, we see this character evolve. Not only does the first gospel that's published, again, as Matthew said, would be Evangelion from Marcion, in the early 140s, maybe late 130s at earliest. At that particular point, the gospel didn't have a birth story. It kind of had Jesus as a demigod who came down, descended out of heaven. And over time, he gets a birth story, he gets a genealogy, and there's 40+ gospels that are written around this time to the 3rd century, and each one is more fantastical than the rest. It just gets more and more bolder, crazier claims.
Yeah. I also just general question. I do have the chat open, so I see questions now and then. Do we want to tackle those later, or you may tackle them as they come up when they're relevant, or how do we want to do that?
Oh, well, normally I try to tackle them like closer to the end. I was just going to ask if there was one question that you felt like was more applicable now.
Yes. So somebody was asking, what's the basis of the late date in one line? How is this all put in there? And I want to reformulate that exactly. So with the Mark 13, and that is paralleled in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, it's called the Little Apocalypse or the Olivet Discourse. So that is generally assumed to be talking about the fall of the temple. And on the face value, it is talking about the fall of the temple. But we can identify that the author of that is not the same author as the rest of Mark, which is problematic. Even that aside, there is very clear reference to something standing on the Temple Mount, the abomination of desolation. St. Jerome was writing on his commentary on Matthew that the Matthew version, and also Mark and Luke by extension, was either talking about when Pilate put pictures of the emperor in the temple or something like that, which there's no evidence for, and there may be one other claim for, or it was a spiritual thing, or it was talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt. So people knew it even back then, that one of the possible things it's talking about was the Bar Kokhba revolt, which happens in 135, and that destroyed all of Judea. And we think that Mark 13 is using the same approach that Daniel does. So if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, it is probably written in the 160s BCE, but it's cast back about 400 years more. But we know it's about 160 BCE because it's talking about the original first destruction of the temple by the Greeks. And they use the same language, abomination of desolation, when they put a statue in there. And that's why they use it in Mark, is because in 135 or around that time period, after Emperor Hadrian more or less wiped out the entire population of Judea and had Jerusalem there, he put up a statue of Jupiter and himself, and we have attestation to this statue in multiple sources. Then when we tie that in with the fact that we can tell that the first 3 or 4 chapters of Luke were written by a different author than the rest of Luke, and that the claim was that either this was from the same author and Marcion stole it, or Marcion originally wrote the first chapters 4 through 23 or so, and then other Christians tacked onto it. Around the same time as the Bar Kokhba revolt, you start putting these things together. The fact that the first collection of Paul's letters that we have comes from the 130s or 140s, also with Marcion. We don't have really any attestation to Paul prior to that, aside from, you might say, First Clement, which we can get into the dating, and the letters of Ignatius and Polycarp, which again we can get into dating. but it all seems to just happen around this 130 area, and that's when we start seeing, responses to Christianity. Celsus starts replying probably 30 years after
Yeah.
that. It all starts to happen around this one time, and we have evidence from multiple angles that it looks like that's when this really kicked off. Not to say that there
Right.
weren't Christians before, but that the story of Jesus and the early apostles came from that era.
Yeah, more or less to put it really simply, it's almost as if there's kind of three iterations of Christianity there in the 2nd century. There's the earliest form of Christianity, which would be like a mystery cult, so to speak, that doesn't have a gospel or Jesus really concept. Then there's the more of like you could say Gnostic period, where it's almost a blend between this mystery cult, or a pretty good blend between the mystery cult and Christianity as we know it. And then finally, the third would be, well, Christianity as we know it, with the Gospels and everything like that, like proto-Catholicism and stuff.
Okay. I am kind of curious because, like, even if let's just, for the sake of argument, let's assume that all this was fabricated in the 2nd century. I don't see how that really informs us about whether or not a person like in the 1st century kicked it off. Even if everything that we know about from the Gospels or from Paul is all like fabricated information, how does that factor into like Jesus existing as a mythical person rather than as a real physical person on earth?
Well, part of the issue is that, yeah, sure. Part of the issue is the fact that a lot of the information, even in the natural sense, for Jesus is either lifted from, some kind of prior work, or just doesn't really make much sense at all. For instance, in reality, there's no evidence whatsoever, or no good evidence to put Nazareth as an actual community or actual town, city there in the first 3 decades of the 1st century. There's evidence of human civilization in the area, sure, but I mean, I can go out into the woods here in rural Texas and find money and forks and tires. That doesn't mean that there's a city there. It just means that people are in the area of it. Nazareth never shows up in any lists or maps until, oh my gosh, I think from a non-Christian standpoint, I don't think it shows up until the 3rd or 4th century. Josephus himself is from Galilee and never mentions Nazareth, but mentions a town that's pretty much right next to it. It's not very big, called Sepphoris. He mentions that multiple times.
Origin can't.
It's never meant. Yeah. Now but part of the issue there is that within the Gospels, Nazareth is referred to as a place that has a synagogue, which is already another anachronistic kind of issue there. But on top of that, it's referred to in a negative sense, as if people know, or they don't like it. They say, oh, what good can come from Nazareth? But that doesn't even line up with what Matthew says, which he claims that there's a prophecy that says Jesus comes from Nazareth to fulfill what the prophets say. But we don't have a prophecy that mentions Nazarene or Nazareth or anything. It's not a town or a city that's mentioned in the Old Testament. The closest.
Sorry, Matthew.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, as far as like the Nazareth thing goes, that doesn't really factor a lot into my conclusion of mythicism, and primarily because of the fact that where we get this whole idea of Nazareth is from the Gospel of Matthew, which at least we can agree is it's a fabricated gospel. It's got fabricated information about Jesus in it,
right?
Whether it comes from the 1st century or later. It's still fabricated information. And then I know that y'all have a different take on Paul than I do, but I take Paul as being earlier than the Gospels, and Paul being our closest piece of information as far as the mainstream goes to like a historical Jesus. He never makes mention of Nazareth as being a major place. So I guess for me, it seems like the whole Nazareth sort of take doesn't really factor in a whole lot to my mythicist position, because like Nazareth could have been completely, settled and everything like that. Second, third century, like I guess it didn't really matter when it got settled or when it turned up, because the whole Nazareth birth story and even the Bethlehem birth story, that doesn't seem to really matter to the earliest records that we have. So I guess I'm not seeing why the Nazareth line is an important part of y'all's mythicist
Because
position.
it's because of the fact that it establishes or it's a part of this natural Jesus that people kind of point to. If you take out the supernatural claims of Jesus or anything like that from the Gospels, raised in Nazareth or coming from Nazareth is a fairly natural concept. But if he can't come from Nazareth because Nazareth isn't a place until later, it's very clearly something that somebody's making up once Nazareth seems to be a town at a later date. But that being said, again, if Matthew in specific is the first to say that Jesus comes from Nazareth, that seems a bit problematic because the Gospels before that are, again, from a data science standpoint, from somebody who believes, or published by somebody who believes that Jesus is just a demigod who is sent from God the Father to ransom humanity's souls from Yahweh, which is Marcion. This is Marcion's theology. He gets more or less excommunicated, prior to that being, or I guess, a thing. But he's deemed a heretic because of these beliefs. But if a heretic in specific is responsible for the first published gospel, and this is his theology, at a certain point, I don't understand why there could really be much of a historical person if the first time that we get something about this person written down is 111 years after the supposed death of the person, and it's from somebody who doesn't think he's a human being. Like it just at a certain point.
Yeah, and so
I mean, there's other reasons, but that
right.
in and of itself is weird.
We think that the Marcionite branch or some proto-Marcionite branch is more or less the origin for the Christian beliefs, and they believed that Jesus was more or less a demigod, like Jaron was saying. His first appearance is actually in Luke 4, what we call Luke 4 now at least, where he descends into Capernaum. He went down into Capernaum is how it's translated now. But in the original version, Marcion's version, he literally descends from the sky. We have multiple attestations to this. And you can see in the Gospel of Luke where the editors, the later Christian editors in the 140s, 150s, 160s, actually flip verses, and they mess the whole story up. You don't really see it, and it's not talked about a lot. But it's Luke 4, let's see, 23, right, Jaron?
Yes, Luke 4:23 is you can notice that, or you can see in the English version of the Bible, you can see where that's where it's more or less starting to stitch together with Marcion's prior gospel.
Right. So what happens there is it's that line, physician, heal thyself. They say, do here in your hometown, because he just arrived at Nazareth again, what you did in Capernaum. Well, two problems with that. First off, in the story of Luke, he has not been to Capernaum yet. He doesn't go to Capernaum until 431. And on top of that, he hasn't performed any miracles or signs or healings yet, because he doesn't do that until later in Luke. But what happened is the later proto-Catholic editors of what we have of Luke today messed up the order in Marcion's gospel. And so we can see that textual evidence there, on top of the fact that we can see the prior 3 chapters were added on by a later author. So the original gospel of Luke, at least, was Marcion's version. And it's very possible that it was the original gospel. And that's exactly when we start seeing attestation to all these figures. For example, Justin Martyr, writing in the 150s and 160s, never says the name Paul one time. So he doesn't have access to gospels. He has what he calls memoirs of the apostles, and maybe they're textual gospels at that point, but he doesn't have our 4 gospels. He seems to use some variation of the gospel of Peter. And before that, we don't have anybody talking about gospels. Even if you attribute like Ignatius and Clement to earlier, they don't talk about any gospels. So like you said, the gospels might have been based on Paul, whether it was that way or the other way around. It's clear that nobody's really talking about gospels until much later.
Right. So in order for Jesus to be a historical figure, that people are following and somehow connected to this Christianity, it would have to be something that after 30 would have been so small that we don't see any sign of them whatsoever. But somehow the story lives on, and once Pliny runs into them up in northern Asia Minor, which means they spread so far from Judea that they go all the way to northern Asia Minor, that he doesn't even find a connection with Judaism or really anything there. There is a letter quoted by a former slave of Emperor Hadrian that mentions that the Christians exist in Alexandria. This is in the 130s. And he says, he's writing to a friend in Alexandria. He says, hey, there's Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, but there's also Christians up in the northern part of the Roman Empire, and they worship Serapis Christus. Now, Serapis in specific was a god that was worshipped in Asia Minor, as well as, Marcion comes from Sinope, as Matthew stated. That is the biggest city in the specific province that Pliny the Younger was governor in 111. So it's just, there's no evidence of a connection between a Jesus figure and Christianity in the earliest form of Christianity, a good 80 years after the supposed death of this person. It's not just an argument of silence for Jesus. It's for Jesus, it's for Paul, it's for the disciples, it's for thousands of supposed Christians. There's just nothing there. But we do see it later as part of an evolution. And that's I guess where I'm coming from. That I understand that people say, hey, how does dating the text later prove that Jesus doesn't exist? And it's like, okay, if you understand how religions evolve, if you understand how thought evolves over time, we can see that in a much clearer view if things are in the 2nd century. That's why people like Bart Ehrman don't exactly want to assume that Jesus is fictional, because if we have texts that are in the 1st century, if we have texts that are dated with these mainstream dates, then it's not that far off from the supposed death. We don't see that evolution like we're talking about as clearly.
Well, so I guess I would say that even if we were to date the Gospels in the 1st century, as well as Paul being like 20 years afterwards, I feel like the theology that's communicated in Paul establishes that Paul considered Jesus to be purely a celestial being. What's y'all's take on like what this Jesus figure actually is in Christianity? My particular version of mythicism establishes like this idea of an already existing archangel figure in Judaism, which then is taken on by like Peter and Paul and all of them as actually accomplishing a crucifixion and resurrection just in the lower heavens, like in the firmament. And there's a lot of evidence behind this kind of idea. That's how they thought about it. And so I'm kind of curious as to what do you guys think about like the actual Jesus person, like as a myth, like regardless of the dating of the Gospels and the dating of Paul, where do you think that this idea came from?
You gonna give your take and then I'll go?
I can give my take. It is kind of hard to prove intent without someone explicitly stating, this is my intention of writing this book. Like, this is what I intend to achieve. It's tough. And it's tough to speculate exactly where some of these things come from. But what I would personally say is that I would say that the concept of Jesus was probably not started as even Jesus or Iosus, seeing as many of the early manuscripts and fragments that we have use the nomina sacra, which would have just had, for lack of better terms here, IS with a little line over it, like an abbreviation for the name Jesus. It also has it for the name or the word Christ, and then it also has it for the word like mankind. So it's not just a simple abbreviation, and it's not just for holy words per se. It's just kind of a strange concept. But That being said, in Alexandria, where Emperor Hadrian was writing that letter to in the 130s, there is a temple to Serapis that also, it was like a dual temple to Serapis and to Isis, which is the Greek name of the Egyptian god Aset. So there's a possibility, and this is just speculation, but there's a possibility that the initial concept of this Jesus wasn't really a Jesus per se, but it could have been a manifestation of male counterpart to Isis, if that means anything. It's just, it's just the evolution of a character as opposed to someone saying, "Hey, I'm actually going to be using this particular Jewish character." I don't think that anybody in the early 2nd century specifically said or wrote the name Yehoshua or anything.
Yeah, and so I'd say for me, I really don't speculate beyond what Marcion's theology seems to have been in when he published the letters of Paul and the first gospel, which was his more or less, in that he believed that there was Yahweh, which was like the demiurge, and then there was a God the Father, who is the father of Jesus, and there were multiple gods. They acknowledged multiple gods, as many mystery cults and other groups did at the time. And then as he had this story out, there was just this debate on whether his character was just a demigod or was it a person who actually came down here in the first place, because the concept of God the Father versus Yahweh is that God the Father uses Jesus to ransom the souls that Yahweh more or less created from Yahweh, who is very apathetic towards the suffering on earth and other things, and that God the Father is the loving character that you read about when Bible and Christians talk about the loving God and stuff like that. That's how that plays in. That's how the Transfiguration probably worked, and that's how they critiqued the Transfiguration of at least Marcion's take on it, where the conversation between Jesus and Elijah and Moses, why is that happening? If you think about it from a Marcionite perspective, it's because they're discussing more or less the terms of this ransom. What does Jesus
Like a
have to
deal.
They're acting on behalf of Yahweh, and Jesus is acting on behalf of God the Father. There are multiple lines in there that are very, very easily interpreted from a Marcionite perspective. So I think the original form of Jesus was just this celestial being that it evolved over time, like Jaron said, and eventually by the first time we get any kind of writing about it, it was this Marcionite type of figure that eventually got misunderstood as a historical figure.
Right. Post 136, you have the Jews leaving Judea, fleeing into the surrounding areas, mixing in with this particular mystery cult of Christianity, and adding a lot more of the Jewish concepts to this particular character. It's only to be expected that over time he's going to be more and more Jewish and more historicized. Obviously, they cared a lot about genealogies and whatnot, so you have the genealogies added. We even see examples of what Judaism looks like whenever it mixes in with the Hellenistic culture. We have the Hypsisterians. I believe they show up around the turn of the 2nd century, correct, Matthew? Mm-hmm. So we have the Hypsisterians, which was like a Hellenistic Jewish cult religion.
They show up in Acts too.
They actually show up in Acts. There's a particular term that they would use for God, and it is used in the book of Acts, where Paul is being followed by a fortune teller. And the fortune teller is saying, "Oh, this man is a servant of the Most High God. This man's a servant of the Most High. He's a slave of the Most High God." That's something that Paul, for the most part, calls himself, is like a slave or a servant to God. So why he takes an issue with this woman is beyond me, if you really read it from like a modern Christian's perspective. That being said, he turns around and he drives out a demon from the woman. But the Most High God, the word that's being used there is the word that the Hypsisterians call their God. So that would be why, in specific, he would have a problem with it at that point. And of course, again, that's a 2nd century concept. So again, I think the only other time, or one of the other times that name is actually used, is with the healing of the demon-possessed man in the Gospels, specifically Luke, I believe, where he drives out the demon from the man, and it goes into the pigs. And the man says, what will you do with us, son of the Most High God? He more or less throwing that term out there again, and then he drives out a demon. It's usually around demon possession is when that term is used.
So, I don't know. I guess I'm finding the case to be a bit too ad hoc for me personally. Just because of there's a lot of things that we kind of have to interpret. Like, you made reference to like Mark 13 and like the destruction of the temple and everything like that. And I mean, I do see in the field, in the scholarly field, that the dating of Paul can work for two different time periods: one in 50 BCE, and then one in around 50 CE, with the least amount of evidence on a 2nd century dating for Paul. One of the reasons for this is that in what we consider to be the authentic epistles, they seem to be written with an ignorance for this coming catastrophic Jewish war in 66 through 70, and it has a lack of any kind of ensuing apocalypse or convenient termination of the Judaism's temple cult and occupation of Jerusalem. So it seems like Paul's stuff, it doesn't make even a passing reference to the future destruction of the temple. So he seems to be ignorant of these issues. And in the 2nd century date, it seems like, whoever was forging these letters, it seems to me like they would already know about this destruction of the temple, and if they wanted to make any kind of foreshadowing things about how the temple was destroyed or anything like that, they could have easily made it. So I'm wondering what's y'all's response to just this first little piece of information about Paul's work and how it fits into like our timeline.
Before Matthew gets into that, I don't understand why anybody writing post 130s, coming up with somebody who's just writing instruction to churches would even mention that. I mean, it just doesn't seem like anything that they would even. Yeah, it would be over 60 years prior, and if it comes from Marcion, he has very little connection to the destruction of the temple. I mean, it just doesn't seem like something that they would be writing. Again, I think a lot of that mentality of where you're like, I see where you're coming from, but that argument, it still holds on to the assumption that this Paul is a Jewish person, because you're like, well, why didn't he mention this thing that matters to the Jews? I don't know, because the person who wrote it wasn't a Jew. It's just, and it's 60 years later, like it has nothing to do with it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but they would be writing like for Jewish Christians, like
no.
at least at some point. I mean, it would be.
Not necessarily. The first time that it comes out, I mean, this is from a man who, the man who publishes is literally trying to say that Yahweh is a terrible God. I fail to see how making Paul, who again is writing instructional material for churches, and coming from a man publishing in like the early 140s, I just don't see why he would make Paul talk about futuristic things or make any kind of prophecies about the destruction of the temple, when that's not even really something that the Gospels, his gospel evangelist, even cared about. It's just not even, it's not connected. It's not in his mind, these people are more or less Greek in his mind, but the background is just Judea. And not to mention, but again, the Paul that is found within the Paul found within Marcionism he's not Jewish per se. There's no biographical information in Paul's epistles from Marcion that's published in this New Testament in 144 or early 140s. There's nothing to connect him to Judea. So you would have to assume that Acts is correct about his biographical information and that he was Jewish, to assume that he would talk about something that mattered to the Jews in the first century.
Well, I mean, just to push back a little bit here, I mean, we do have like in Galatians, Paul talking about how he used to be a Jew. He was the most learned Jew at the time, and he read the Jewish text and everything like that. So it kind of seems to me like
What
Paul's
chapter is that, Matthew?
Yeah, it's in there. That's Galatians 1 or 2.
But Galatians 1 or 2 isn't that the section?
Yeah, those have been added much later, but I mean, we haven't got into that. So just for
Okay.
clarification,
Well,
we don't
sure.
think Paul was a real figure. There's no historical evidence for Paul. The 7 letters, from a stylometric perspective, that are authentic are not actually matching by the same author. Check out one article if you're interested in that. It's called Authorship of Pauline Epistles Revisited by Jacques Savoy, if you wanted a peer-reviewed article instead of our book. So that goes into...
This is from 2019. 2019.
Yeah, it's from 2019. There's a lot of work from scholars like Herman Dietering and Marcus Vincent and a bunch of other people that date these texts into the 2nd century. There's a good book coming out, supposed to already be out, but it's not, by Dr. Nina Livesey, which she uses a rhetorical perspective, and she puts all of the letters into the middle of the 2nd century, just like we do. It's called, let me pull it back up. It's the letters of Paul in their Roman literary context. So it's supposed to be out. It's not out yet because she's writing, she's publishing through Cambridge University Press, and they had some like technical issue a while back and haven't got their press up and running again or something to that effect. But there's a lot of, like you were saying earlier, there are scholars that have something similar to our position. But why, I agree with Jaron, is like, why is this not talked about? First off, I would say to a degree it's talked about. There is not a lot of biographical information in Paul's 7 authentic letters in the first place, outside of Galatians 1 and 2. And there's definitely nothing that really places him in any period of time. There is a line about a King Aretas, and he was persecuted by King Aretas. That's in 2 Corinthians. That the problem is, people normally will try to place that in the 1st century, but there was no King Aretas that controlled the city that Paul was fleeing from in that time period. So that is a problem. He uses some anachronistic language in regards to certain Roman provinces. For example, in Romans, he mentions Illyrica. Illyrica stopped being a province in the 10s, maybe 20s. 8 CE. So even before Paul probably would have been born, or like right after. He said he traveled there. So that's anachronistic. So it would either be somebody, like you were saying, in the BCE era, or somebody writing so far removed from this period that they're trying to hit this time period and they're missing. And like we agree to a lesser extent, there were multiple people writing under Paul's name.
Right.
Like Ephesians is not authentic. Any of the 1st, 2nd Timothy's not authentic. We just take it a little bit further based off of the data science and say, really, there's like 3, maybe 3.5 letters that were written by the same person. There is no attestation to Paul or any of his writings prior to the 130s, unless you want to get First Clement and Ignatius, which again we can deal with. And so we're looking at really late attestation to a Paul figure at all.
And not only that, but Galatians 1 and 2, which is why I wanted to make sure that that's where it was. Galatians 1 and 2 we see is added later. Those are chapters in specific of Galatians. When we say that Paul, so I don't know if we've made the statement so far, but I say it on TikTok all the time. So I apologize if I assume that I've said something, but I just said it some other time. So Paul in specific, you might be able to say that this is potentially a 2nd century author or something like that. Like you might be able to carve him out, possibly, because there does seem to be a one particular author of bits and pieces of 4 of the epistles, specifically the same epistles that F.C. Bauer and I believe Streck and Jacques Savoy found to be Pauline, which would be Romans, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians. But it's bits and pieces of those. Galatians in specific has chapter 1 and 2 that we see from the stylometric analysis were added later. It's not from that same author. So what you're talking about, where he establishes himself as the most learned Jew and everything like that, that's something that's not from the same person who wrote the rest of it.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess what's more convincing to me is just that these letters, even if they are forged, seem to be letters from somebody who's writing to people who were Jews at one time. At least that's the presentation of it. So it kind of makes sense to me that like important events from Jewish history would also be important to them. And if they were forging something to prior to the destruction of the temple, like some kind of foreshadowing or some kind of mention of a coming destruction or something like that might be important. So I guess that's kind of where I'm coming at it, like from my point of view on that. I mean, honestly, I'm trying to give a little bit of pushback here just to see how well y'all formulated your
Right,
argument.
right.
But
No, I
Yeah.
understand.
So
No,
yeah.
no,
no.
yeah, I'm for me personally, like the gospels really don't factor into my mythicist position. And
Yeah,
so it's
yeah.
interesting to hear how it seems to factor into it for y'all.
Well,
Yeah.
that's because if you, from a data science perspective, we see Evangeline and the 10 letters of attributed to Paul there in this first New Testament or New Covenant from Marcion in the early 140s. That's the first time that we really get texts that we can kind of say, okay, this is a pretty surefire or steadfast anchor in time that we can hold on to. So I guess we put Evangeline on the same level as these Pauline epistles. So when people point to Paul and they say, oh, hey, we think that the writings of Paul would be the best attestation for Jesus or the best example of what the earliest Christian believes, fine. But we're going to say that came out at about the same time as Evangeline. So that's why we utilize the Gospels about as much as Paul, if that makes sense. But again, the problem is the fact that the stolometry shows a much more stripped down version of Paul than what we see in today's Pauline epistles or accepted Pauline epistles. And it's just, it's something that's added to. It's something that's added to, and it just appears different. It makes Paul very Jewish. It makes Paul very historical, but it's just not very historical. It's not a ton of historical information in the epistles themselves, but it makes him more historical than initially the epistles did, the writings did.
So yeah, really, really fast. I'm going to jump in on that too, because I know this is a hot take about Paul. So think about what is our reception of Paul's letters? So like, when do we see them in the history of Christianity? And I don't mean like, so let's talk about like, first off, manuscript evidence. So we always got to rely on like physical evidence first. There is no, as you know, archaeological evidence for Jesus. There's no archaeological evidence for Paul either. There's no kind of testimonium Flavianum for Paul in any text. The first thing we would see would be First Clement. So First Clement is dated to either the 60s or to the 90s is normally how it's dated. So we disagree with that. Go figure. But we find that not only is it a composite text, but we don't hear about that text, First Clement, until the 180s with Irenaeus. We don't have manuscript evidence for it to be earlier either. We don't have evidence or manuscript evidence for Paul's letters being earlier either. Those come in like the 200s or so. Then after First Clement, the next thing we get of mentioning Paul at all would be the letters of Ignatius. And the letters of Ignatius, both that and First Clement, have different stories about Paul. So in First Clement, it says Paul went to jail like 7 times, and it's kind of ambiguous on whether he made it to Spain or not. In Ignatius, there's something about one of the, like, supposedly there's letters that we don't have. Same thing with the letter to Polycarp. He mentions things that we don't have from Paul, but it's like this misunderstanding of who Paul is. That doesn't even get into the question of whether or not these texts quote the pastoral epistles, which arguably the letter of Polycarp does, which puts it much later too. So after that, other than those, there is no citation of Paul at all. And like I mentioned earlier, Justin Martyr, who seems to know some Pauline material maybe, does not ever mention the name Paul. And he's writing from Rome, which supposedly Paul founded that church. So by that point, why is somebody in the 150s, 160s not even mentioning the person's name, who founded the church that he lives in, who founded apparently most of the churches throughout Asia Minor. Why does Revelation not mention Paul when supposedly he founded like 2 or 3 of the churches, I think, that are mentioned in Revelation? There's no reference to them. There's no real attestation to Jesus. There's no attestation to Paul. The thing is, we just have letters with Paul's name on it as opposed to a story about it. The story about it comes later. It's Acts, But these fake letters were common all the time. They added in fake personal details. If you look at First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus, they have a ton of fake personal details about like, go grab my cloak from here, and my friend just did this. They would add those fake things. It's like there's fake letters within Harry Potter, but it doesn't mean the characters actually existed because it's in letter format rather than narrative format.
Right. Dr. Nina Livesey actually points out that there's, I believe it's Seneca, there in the first century, has his followers, or not necessarily followers, but his school in specific, write fake letters or letters using a pseudonym specifically for teaching. And so she actually points out that the Marcionites would have done about the same thing. And that's more or less our take on it, that these Pauline letters that Marcion publishes in the early 140s are more or less something that comes from the Marcionite school, so to speak. And that Paul is just a catch-all name, so to speak, for these particular writings. I mean, letters back then are something that people wrote from fictional characters all the time. We have letters from Hercules, Hercules' wife, forest nymphs. It's not far-fetched to assume that these things are not really from a particular person who existed.
Well, I was just gonna say that. So I get the the forgery aspect of it, because these things did happen, but the the Pauline epistles seem to be stitched together, pieces of other letters from Paul. And even in whole books, we have multiple different introductions or multiple closing out, and it just kind of seems like they're letters that are stitched together. And it just seems like at that particular time, that's not how these types of letters were forged. It kind of seems like if you were in the 2nd century and you were forging these types of things, you would have like it just be one big long letter instead of like multiple different letters, and spot or I guess so a selected grouping of letters that they have stitched together and just called like Galatians or Corinthians or whatever. What would you say to that?
Well, you would still find consistency, though, is what I'm saying. You'd still find consistency.
Even with the known fake letters, so like Ephesians and Colossians, arguably Ephesians has this kind of division of its text, which even though it's agreeably faked, more or less across the board, people think it's fake, it still has that kind of like different authors editing it over time. Same thing arguably with 2nd Thessalonians. There have been cases made where 2nd Thessalonians is also a composite letter, but you're right, they are stitched together. And we would agree that, and we're able to see that because when we look chapter by chapter, we can see the layers at which these were edited. And so we can tell when this was edited by the same group of people, at least, that wrote the pastoral epistles, and they often have similar themes. So I know Colossians is a fake letter. We more or less agree on that, but it has something in there that looks very much like a pastoral epistle in terms of morality and stuff like that. And it turns out that it lumps together in that group because that was the group that pushed this specific agenda. Even though they were written in the 130s, 140s, that doesn't mean that they didn't still go under edits. It's very clear when you read works of Irenaeus and Tertullian and others, they were having this battle of which version of these letters of Paul were original. Even in the 200s and so when Tertullian was writing, he had a different letter, a different version of Galatians than what we have today and from what Marcion had. So there were multiple versions of these letters floating around, but no one's referencing them until the 130s, 140s or later. So I think if you want to put Paul earlier, you have to explain why that these letters don't get any attention. And then, of course, and again, if we want to talk about First Clement and Ignatius, we can. We talked a little bit about it, but they have a different version of Paul because the story hasn't been solidified yet because he's still a made-up character. and they haven't worked out the details. Same reason why Gospels disagree about Jesus is why Paul A and Paul B and First Clement and Polycarp and Ignatius all disagree about who Paul was.
Yeah, I mean, that's why you have people like Richard Carrier, who, again, we agree with this conclusion, who can point to certain things there within Paul, but then you could have some other historicist who could say, oh, I'm going to point to the letters of Paul too, and try to go the opposite direction. It's like, well, okay, great. That's because these things have definitely been added to over time by people who are trying to make Paul more historical and Paul believe in a more historical Jesus. But even Tertullian, as Matthew mentioned, even Tertullian had some massive questions about Paul's authenticity. And he said that, he has his versions of Paul's letters, which is how he believes that Marcion, according to him, didn't just make up Paul with Galatians.
Okay. I know earlier you kind of, I guess, were confused about the importance of the temple culture and the temple in general, as far as like Paul's letters go. But it seems to me like they all kind of make arguments and interact rather persuasively in context where the Jewish temple was still standing and its cult was still operating. And so it kind of seems like, at least what we have of what y'all are considering the forged version of Paul, he still is very conscious about the temple and its importance to the Jewish people, as well as, its importance in the Christian narrative. So, I mean, do you feel like that throws a wrench in your idea at all, or what do you think about that?
I'd say that a lot of this is very much like the Jewish tradition of writing back characters. So you have Daniel again that's writing in the 100s BCE, and we pretty much have like a 3-year date range. It's like 167 to 164 BCE, writing as if he is in the 400s or 500s BCE. Same with the Gospels. They're writing back because they're using these past events. They're using scripture to interpret their current situation. So the current situation for them is very similar to the 70-ish era, in which in the 70s, the temple's destroyed. In 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt results in the destruction of all of Judea. That's why the cultural and religious center shifts to Galilee, and it's why we see the Jesus story in Galilee. When it comes to the Paul letters, I mean, I would say I kind of think I disagreed with Jaron a little bit on that point, but I think overall we agree. Like, it is so far past that it doesn't matter, but I think there are lines. So like First Thessalonians, which is considered authentic. Is it 2? Let me pull it up. It's First Thessalonians 2, 16.
14.
It's 14 through 16. And I know it's considered an interpolation, but it's almost like, and a lot of Christians will complain like, oh, you just interpolate, like you say this is interpolation, so you throw it out. We would say that's actually original, that we don't see any indication that overall, we only do chapter level. First Thessalonians 2 is an interpolation from the rest of the First Thessalonians letter. We see that as that is talking about either the destruction of the temple, or it's talking about the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Same thing with like Romans 9 through 11. I know a lot of people think that was written by a different author than the rest of Romans. We do find something similar to that, but it's talking about like, has God forsaken Israel and stuff like that. And interesting that a lot of scholars will point out is notably he uses the phrase like Israel and stuff, which does not appear a lot in the rest of Romans or Paul. But the context of Christianity arising, regardless of whether you think it's 70 or 135, I think is agreed that it's in this Hellenistic situation, and there's a lot of Jewish, believers who have just had their worlds upended, either due to the destruction of the temple or to Judea entirely, and they're trying to reinterpret that. And Paul is an attempt to reinterpret that. So that's what this is all about. He's writing to Gentiles, but there's very clearly stuff to a Jewish, portion of his readership or whatever. So I don't know, for us, and again, we try to go back to like, what is the historical evidence? What is the data? Not only data science, but like, what is the line of how we get Paul's letters? Like, there is, in our opinion, no justification for placing Paul in the 1st century, because there's no reception of Paul in the 1st century or the first half of the 2nd century. And the only link you have even to the 1st century is really First Clement, which is a composite letter and doesn't even agree about Paul's biography or his life. So,
and comes up with other authors that we find from 140, 150.
Yeah, it's very clearly, it's an anonymous letter from a person, supposedly from a person that they can't agree whether he was the second, third, or fourth pope. And we don't get any evidence for that letter until like the 180s. And yeah, and it's clearly a composite letter. So just like Paul's letters are, I mean, they're very much stitched together.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Were you gonna? Sorry, I didn't. I didn't want to possibly interrupt you if you were gonna.
No, I saw somebody say I need to move closer to the mic, so I was kind of scooting forward a little bit.
Okay. So I know that y'all mentioned the I'm gonna be horrible at pronouncing his name, but the Aretas, Aretas.
Oh yeah,
we call him Aretas. Aretas is what we
I
say.
say Arta. It's a name.
Oh well, I
Right.
thought we did, but I guess it's just me.
Yeah.
So
no.
I mean, like this is one major argument for placing Paul in the 50s, at least writing somewhere in the 50s, because I believe it's 2 Corinthians 11:32 where he mentions King Aretas having the city of Damascus.
Oh.
Yeah, guarded in order to arrest him, and it seems like it could be two possible people, Aretas the Fourth or Aretas the Third. Aretas the Fourth would be from 9 BCE to 40 AD, whereas Aretas the Third would be from 87 to 62 BCE. And so it seems like there's two different people that this could be talking about. So I'm kind of curious how do you tackle the Aretas problem as far as like, dating Paul to the 50s, regardless of whether the person's name was Paul or they invented that name or whatever. They're calling him Paul, but they're placing him in the 50s.
So like you said, there are two characters this could be. And first, we're gonna go chronologically. So like the third is, like you said, in the BCE era. So he did have control of Damascus for about a 3-year period. So we have archaeological evidence and textual evidence that he did control that area.
Yes.
But that doesn't help for a 50s CE Paul. And then we get to the possibility of the Artas IV. There is no evidence that Artas IV ever held that region, ever. So if you can check it out. I like to say check it on Wikipedia, but you can check on Wikipedia, you can check original sources. There is no evidence for him actually holding that place. People will come up with ways to make him hold that region, like, oh, maybe he held like part of the city or had an agreement where like he could have his own governor in a foreign city for whatever reason, because that totally happens. There was no control of that city by Artas IV, which is used normally to date Paul. And beyond that, Paul's biography is very I won't say generic, but it's just very removed from time.
Limited.
And that also, yeah, it's just like there's no references other than that one and like one other to any events in history that we have external reference to.
I do want to give some credit to the whole fact that dating Paul seems to be a rather complicated and involved process. So
right.
there is that part of it, because it seems like that there's sort of a tiered list as to when Paul could have existed. 50s BCE, and then that Jesus would have been the Jesus under King Janaeus, and then there's 50s CE, which that would be the Jesus that supposedly existed under Pilate. And then obviously in scholarship now there's two people, Trobish and Vincent. Both of them have advanced different positions that place like at least the Gospels and a lot of the material in the 2nd century hasn't gained a lot of footing in the scholarship, because there seems to be a lot of issues that scholars are having a problem with it. And so but I will give you that it's rather difficult to place a solid date on like when Paul was. But I feel like, me personally, I feel like the evidence is leaning more on either 50s BCE or 50s AD, like one of those two particular regions. And that's just because of the problem that you just highlighted, the fact that we don't have a lot of biographical information about Paul. But anyway, sorry, I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, that's right. And if we wanted to go over the evidence for dating Paul, I mean, we can, and we do in the book. I mean, we have a whole section of more or less building up a hypothetical BCE Paul, because we want to show, like you were saying, there is a decent case for him to be
Yeah.
put in the BCE era,
Yeah.
because some of the language he uses is almost exclusive to that era, or at least to before 8 CE, because Illyricum was not a province. You could make some very broad argument maybe that it was like a broad region and not a province in the minds of people, but province-wise, it's clearly not a province after that region. They
Yeah.
split it in two
It,
after a
it would
revolt.
be like someone from Gen Z saying that they vacationed over in the USSR. Like, it wouldn't make any sense.
You'd know what they're talking about, but like
Yeah.
it's clearly a weird way of saying something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is, I mean, there are some other points that we make. There's some slight points there for Paul being in the 2nd century. Again, even in some of the Pauline epistles, we do see some names. This could very easily be in the sections. Some of them are in the sections that are added later, but they're 2nd century. A lot of these people are 2nd century figures within Christianity that are more or less getting a little bit of a cameo, if you will, into the text.
Okay. So I'm guessing that your responses to a lot of the arguments that historicists normally lob your way is just simply that Paul or the Gospels don't have any kind of real representation on history. Would that be correct?
Yeah. We don't have any reason. I mean, if you just extend the same more or less logic you used with Jesus to Paul, then they're all 2nd century in our eyes, at least. They're 2nd century, and they're talking about a very clearly defined theology of a heavenly Father as opposed to a Yahweh, and this concept of ransom. You even see ransom language in Paul, and it's just by the time you get to the 2nd century, it has evolved from whatever origins it had in its mystery cult, origins there, to what becomes Christianity. So yeah, it was all made up, and they just continued to build on the narrative from the theology. And so it's more or less like you get more and more developed stories of other, Greek figures. You just write more stories over time. And so the stories is a lot of times end up with the gods coming to earth. And that was more or less what happens here.
And they continue to use, again, some of these prior sources that I had mentioned earlier. One of the sources for these, even the natural stories of Jesus, and even some of the natural stories of Paul found in Acts, come from the works of Josephus. I know that we get into that in the book, but one of my personal favorites is the crucifixion scene. At the end of the crucifixion scene, even found in the earliest Gospels, even found in Evangelion, is three men crucified, and a man named Joseph just appears suddenly. It literally says the word in Greek there for Mark is "behold." Joseph, he just appears. Joseph of Arimathea shows up and asks for permission to take down Jesus's body. Obviously, it's assumed that the second, or the two men that he was crucified next to, die, and he eventually, obviously, survives. Jesus does. Found within Josephus's Vita, or his autobiography, Life of Flavius Josephus, I believe it's in sections 420 and 421. You have him, Josephus, whose Aramaic name is Joseph, or Jewish name is Joseph, finding three men crucified, and he asks Titus, the Roman leader in charge, for permission to take the bodies down. Two of the men die, and one of them survives. I mean, it's pretty clearly at the very end just a random inclusion of Josephus, who we would argue is actually the place that a lot of these stories of Jesus come from. And again, over time, you have the gospel writers noticing that that's a pretty good source and using more of it. The author who finally, I would say, compiles as opposed to writes, but compiles Luke by taking Evangelion and adding things to it, also writes Acts, and in Acts, they utilize that as well. I believe it's even Dr. Litwa, I believe, who has shown that Luke definitely uses Josephus or Luke is in the 2nd century. I think that's something that he's been talking about here recently. But what my point is that, the idea of Luke using Josephus has already been floated around for quite some time. And Acts, of course, uses them as well with like some of the shipwrecks there for Paul.
Wait, the shipwrecks are from Josephus, or
yeah, Josephus.
I know
so
Dennis,
one of the shipwrecks there in Acts for Paul, he should have been on the exact same ship as Josephus, if that's. I mean, but of course he doesn't get mentioned by Josephus, of course. But yeah, it's same shipwreck.
Okay, well, I know that Dennis. What do you think of Dennis R. MacDonald's argument about in his 2 shipwreck gospels, where apparently that particular narrative, I believe he said it was in Acts, was actually inspired by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey.
Yeah, I've got his big book, the synopses one, the big blue one you can get on Amazon somewhere here. I don't remember where it is. Probably down there. Can't reach it.
Somewhere
I know,
right?
right? I got a few books over here ready. So like I've got this one on Philemon and I've got a few others, but didn't have that one ready. But yeah, so I would agree, and I think Jaron does too, like that, yes, some scenes are definitely taken from like the Homeric content and other Greek content. I think, he also puts John's source as like a Bacchae type of source there, Euripides Bacchae play. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of sourcing from earlier Greek material. I don't know which shipwreck Jaron's talking about exactly, but yes,
multiple.
Okay, multiple. Yeah, so like there's multiple places where he clearly uses like prior sources, which I think is the general point. Like Josephus is there, and that was in the Acts seminar. So they did an Acts seminar after they did a Jesus seminar, and they pretty much came away with the conclusion that it's entirely historical fiction drawn from earlier sources, Josephus, Homer, etc. MacDonald was one of the people there presenting, and so you can kind of see their votes, and it's interesting if you're into that level of looking into the history of thought on this thing.
And it just so happens that Acts is where we get biographical information of Paul, so
a lot of it, yeah, aside from that line in Galatians, and then line, but the chapter, which is suspiciously paralleling Marcion's biography too, but
Oops.
Yeah. So now, like I said before, my position is really built on a Bayesian method rather than this linguistic sort of method, and I'm wondering, what do you find the Bayesian method to be lacking, or is there any particular reason why you're choosing this linguistic style of analysis over like a Bayesian weighing of the evidence that we have?
So I'd say that we are just looking at different evidence is all it is. It's not that we're abandoning a Bayesian approach to looking at the evidence, as opposed to what we are doing is using the New Testament text as a new form of evidence. So we're not abandoning like the way we would say that like Carrier's analysis in terms of like that would all, aside from his Paul stuff where he puts Paul as a historical figure, that would still all hold, if you agree with his premises and his like conclusions and everything like that, then yeah, it's all good there. All we're doing is we're saying when we were approaching this, we're like, we need a way to look at these texts specifically in a way that is less biased. It doesn't involve us interpreting like Greek and interpreting what someone nearly 2,000 years ago meant. We can just say, well, this is clearly from a different author. So then that means like you have one or two conclusions here. We had to rethink our whole position when we realized that like the 7-letter hypothesis for Paul just didn't hold up. I was really expecting that going into it, and that's what threw us into looking into it's called the Dutch Radical School, and back in the 1800s they were questioning the authenticity of all of Paul as well, and then it kind of fell out of favor. And then, like you said, Vincent, Trobish, Bilby, Bull, Livesey, a bunch of others.
Would you say Badun as well? Probably.
I think I don't want to speak for Badun. He hasn't published on the Pauline letters specifically since, as far as I know, since his publication of his reconstruction of Marcion's version of the letters. But I think he also points out the fact that like it's not really used until much later. So if you were to take the Bayesian analysis that Carrier does using what we do, then I think that would just make it stronger that
Right.
there was no historical Jesus, because like really all you could still have the position that Jesus was crucified in like a celestial realm and
Yeah.
still have the text written in the 130s or 140s. I mean, that wouldn't impact it at all in terms of that aspect.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I would say that Carrier's analysis of the text um, definitely show that Paul at least considered Jesus to be this celestial figure who was made in the image of man, flesh and blood and everything like that, crucified in the heaven. So whether or not Paul was in the first century or second century, forged or whatever, it seems like the message that was being communicated at the time seems to be that message. Would you
I
disagree with that, or?
I would just say that our particular, if you look at the epistles, you look at the gospels based on our particular dating, that it amplifies Carrier's argument. I mean, if you just strip away those parts, then yeah, I mean, you could very clearly find a Paul who believes in a this demigod type celestial Jesus who it doesn't really sound too terribly historical per se, like here on Earth at least, um, because it's coming from, again, somebody who very clearly believed in a almost a docetism, almost kind of Jesus, almost docetism, but a very Gnostic type Jesus that was just again a demigod who just came down. Um, I would say that if you carve away the pieces in specific that were added to the Pauline epistles, and you look at that and you apply Carrier's method to what we have, again, I think it lock and step, perfect, just absolutely crushes any particular historicist view out there. I think it's very compatible. You just have to kind of aim it in the right spot. Time-wise,
Right. So I'm just kind of curious as to like what kind of pushback have you gotten, like I guess from the community, as far as like, because it does seem like a pretty radical position to take that Paul didn't exist and everything like that. What's kind of the pushback been? Um, uh, what kind of responses have you garnered from people about how quote unquote wrong you are? Whether you're right or wrong, like from my position, it doesn't matter whether Paul was later or earlier or whatever. I
right.
still think that, Jesus was mythical and that these earliest Christians, however early they are, believed in a more a celestial version of Christ rather than a historical version of Christ. But I'm just wondering what kind of pushback y'all get.
I would put it in two main camps. One camp is an appeal to authority, or argumentum ad populum, or something like that. Just generic. Hey, you guys are fringe, so
Yeah, you disagree with
GTFO.
scholars, so we're
Yeah,
not going to hear any evidence. We just,
exactly.
yeah,
And the other camp would be people who have a tenuous grasp on how stellometry works. Just people who, for the most part, assume that stellometry has to work from a machine learning or AI kind of thing, where you feed it information and say, I want you to feed the software information and say, I want you to look for a author who looks like this. That's a pretty common one from people who aren't just getting onto TikTok and telling us we're going to hell. Some there are some people who say, hey, look, I don't think that your approach to stellometry is correct. We ask them why, and they say because the way that you're supposed to do it, or the way that it works, is you tell it, hey, this is what Paul looks like, and then it tries to find any text that seems to come from that particular author. And that's called a supervised model, and that's not how we ran it, because we didn't feel like that would be, for lack of a better term, very scientific of us, to make an assumption or a presupposition and then work off of that. you can run it that way, but that's not how we did it. We wanted to approach it with a very hands-off kind of method, and see, what all comes out in the results from just telling it, here's all the works of the New Testament, here's everything we can get our hands on in Greek. What do you see? Is basically what we told Stylo.
Okay. I know, why I asked that just to lead into, I guess, the issues that I have with accepting y'all's hypothesis. And that's primarily because it seems like, regardless of all of the dating and everything like that, it seems to be at its core sort of an argument from silence. And I know that there can be two different kinds of arguments from silence. There's a strong argument from silence, and then there can be weak arguments from silence. And I guess I just kind of feel like y'all are coming at it from like, well, there's no mention of Paul, Jesus, or any of these things prior to this time. And therefore it didn't, like, they didn't exist, or they couldn't have existed, or something along those lines. Have you ever gotten that kind of pushback? And regardless of that particular question, what would y'all's response be to anybody claiming that you're just, using an argument from silence?
So, I mean, I feel like the biggest difference between argument of silence and then what we're doing is that we provide a development theory, and we address every instance of where there would be something, but there's not. I mean, but like, it's like saying, you're claiming that there's an argument of silence for George Washington living in the 1700s because no text before the 1600s or whatever mentions him. So like, yeah, that's true. They don't, because he didn't exist before then. In this case, it's that, yet we point out, like, yes, there's nothing, there's silence. But we actually can point to this guy in the 150s never mentions the name Paul. The evidence for Jesus is very similar. They don't have names for Jesus until much later in the thing. Like Jaron was saying, Pliny mentions a Christ, and there's no mention of texts. There's no mention of connections to Judea. There's no mentions of, any of that. And again, that's silence, yes. But then we see an evolution. And then so we start to get evidence for these things as they develop. And so we see a development there. It's not just a silence. We put it into a timeline to show more or less how it evolved. And I think the main thing is we're just not relying on early Christians to tell us what to believe. They tell us that Paul was back then. They tell us that Ignatius was this time. They tell us Clement was this time. That's all coming from normally Eusebius, but other church sources. So what we do is we look at it from that data perspective. And we think it's more than silence. We're presenting positive evidence for a creation of at least Luke and a lot of other content in the New Testament into the middle of the 2nd century. Jaron, it looks like you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, when you look at when you question whether or not George Washington was in the 16th century or 17th century, 18th century, that kind of thing, which I think you said 17th century, but I think he would have been in the 18th. But either way, point is, what you see with George Washington is you see stories that might not have a lot of biographical information at first, but it starts to have stories of him and his young adult life and everything like that. And then eventually there's more and more stories, and you start to see stories about his childhood and everything. But again, before that though, there's nothing, and so again, just as the question would be, why isn't, are you using the argument of silence to say that George Washington wasn't there in the 17th century? Kinda. But what we see later on is we see the evolution of stories about George Washington, because he's a character or a person in in this particular century, not in the century before, where there's nothing on him. So it's similar to that kind of concept, as Matthew pointed out. We see the evolution of the gospel stories. And quite frankly, it doesn't really make any sense to have a very early gospel, say Mark or something, and no one else writes anything, and then all of a sudden we see a huge boom. A lot of the other gospels that don't make it into the canon, they are very easily attributed to authors in the mid to late 2nd century, the 3rd century, that kind of thing. We're just doing the exact same thing with the other text. Why there would be 4 really good ones at first, and then decades later, there's this huge boom in Gospels. Just, Again, it doesn't really make much sense. But we also see evolution of not just the text, but the religion itself. One of the things that you would typically find with a very new religion, as opposed to something that had been around for quite some time. A good example of this would be or a good analogy to this would be the Mormons. During Joseph Smith's lifetime, there were, I believe, 9 different forms of Mormonism that started during his lifetime. And in the 30 years after his death, there was another about 20 or so. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different forms of Mormonism sprouting from one particular form of it, the earliest form, very, very quickly into the life of the religion. We see these different sects of Christianity in the 2nd century. We don't typically see them in the 1st. In fact, I can't remember exactly who it was, and Matthew might be able to help me out, but there was a particular church father that said that apparently the gospel message was absolutely pure from the life of Jesus all the way until Marcion. And that's just not something we know happens in reality. As soon as Jesus died, if there were people that were following him going into different parts of the, if there were, say, 12 disciples, you would immediately, pretty much overnight, get 12 different versions of Christianity. And so we just see this thing shifted into the 2nd century. Pretty much the entire religion, if you will, shifted into just about the 2nd century, the turn of the 2nd.
Okay. So personally, I'm still not convinced, but I'm definitely open to, having my mind changed. And I, am going to be listening to y'all's book. And I so appreciate y'all coming on and, having this dialogue with me, because while I'm not convinced of this particular way to get to mythicism, obviously I'm going to bring this up because Matthew actually put chat in the side there about other scholars that are also making these particular conclusions. Maybe not the mythicist conclusion, but some of these datings and everything like that. We do have some comments and questions to kind of go through. Are y'all okay sticking around for a few questions?
Yeah, I'm good. I guess Jaren's not.
Jaren's like, fuck this GE guy. I can't stand him.
I'm betting almost 100% his phone died. So whenever we go at like a certain amount, because he's on his phone, and like there have been TikTok lives where if we didn't get banned for a little bit, then there he is. Then his phone died. Was it your phone dying?
No. I tried to pull up the chat and it completely took me out.
I got the chat, but yes, I'm okay with it. Jaren may leave again if we get to comment.
Yeah. Words from other people, feedback. I know.
All right, so first is Infidel. He says, sincere question. I'm not sure which way I lean, but also don't really care much. Am I a mythicist? And I get the, I don't really care about this, like, kind of comment all the time. Obviously, Infidel, if you don't think that Jesus was purely a myth, then you're not a mythicist, but I'll leave that up to you. How do you guys respond when people are like, I don't really care whether or not he was historical, kind of sentiment?
It's
fair
fine.
enough. I mean, yeah. I feel like it, especially to the level we're getting into it here, like a lot of people just don't have interest in digging that deep on, like, did one figure that they don't really care about, if they're not religious, exist or not. It's like, did Socrates exist? Like, I don't know. I don't care. Like, so
yeah, it doesn't really have an effect on my life. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, overall, we do get the opposite of this question a lot, where people will say, why do you care? Like, why do you care so much about this? And it's like, well, number one, it's just interesting, and if we're going to write a book, then you got to pick a particular topic. And this one was something that mattered a lot to us growing up, and still matters a lot to people who are everywhere around us right now. We're here in, North Texas and the Bible Belt and everything. So, it's very prevalent, in just about every aspect of our society. There's something religious, and most of the time it's Christianity. And most of the time it's the form of Christianity that takes just about everything in the Bible literally, including obviously Jesus. So, it's something that matters to a lot of people, and it's something that's, on the forefront of our mind a lot. But our next project goes into other things, but I mean, it's just our first topic.
Yeah, and I want to comment really fast. Somebody said that it's a cop-out, that we don't want to, like, we're saying that people who didn't look into it deep enough to agree with us. What I meant was having the conversation like you are with us. Like, we don't agree on this, but like most people are not going to get into the weeds on like, did Paul exist, or like which letters were actually authentic. We're just saying that like most people, and we come across this on TikTok and everywhere, and most people in their daily lives just are not interested that in that level. They either believe in Jesus, and like that's a no brainer that he existed and he was religious, or like they're just I guess apatheists or whatever, and they don't really care either way, and it doesn't really matter to them. That doesn't make us right or wrong. We're just saying a lot of people just don't have the interest. So when people say I don't care whether Jesus was mythical or not, it's just like, that's cool, it's fine.
Yeah. And even the people who think he did exist, don't really get too much in the weeds usually. We'll talk to people and say, hey, did Jesus exist? And they say, yeah. And I said, hey, do you have proof of it? And they're like, well, no. They might not even know the word Josephus or Tacitus, or, very few people know of Marcion, in regards to the amount of Christians out there. But I mean, it's just something that people don't usually get too much of a deep dive into.
Yeah. I do want to say that we had a couple of super chats. One was from Kevin Beeler, who just did a super sticker looking to support the show here. Really appreciate it there, Kevin. And then there's the name is Donald Trump's 34 Convictions, who says, just because I didn't know I was a member, cheers. You can gift memberships here on YouTube now. And so that's probably what happened. Somebody gifted memberships, and Donald Trump's 34 Convictions got that. All right. So next question is from Big Zebra, who says, has this computerized text analysis been used to determine which letters of Paul are genuine? And I'm assuming yes, and y'all have a complex answer for it.
The easiest is that it's bits and pieces of four epistles.
But we would say it's all dated. It's by one person. But if
by one person,
summarize it, we say that there would be 4-ish letters. If you want a deeper dive into it, and not from us, check out Jacques Savoy, his article in 2019, Authorship of Pauline Epistles Revisited. I'll type that into the chat in just a second. It's like a 10-page article or something, and he comes to the conclusion that it is probably like 3 or 5 or something to that effect, because he can't really explain away how these results show that it's either like 3 of them or like 5 of them, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I'll type that up.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Next question. What specific academic credentials do these authors have?
None.
So, yeah, in the terms of religion, I mean, I guess Matthew has a bachelor's in philosophy and religion. My bachelor's is in economics and statistics, so like data science kind of things.
Okay. Which, I mean, there's there's several authors in the space that don't necessarily have credentials, but and I don't have the Kindle version, but do y'all make references to like the authors that like Matthew has put in the chat and everything in the book?
Oh, yes.
And I think our thing about like this is that like we explain in one chapter entirely, the whole chapter is how to run these tests yourself. So you don't have to rely on us. You don't have to trust us. The software is free. The texts are online free. It's all done in like the original Greek language. So we try to be as open about it as possible, because we are open to the possibility we're wrong. And we want to encourage scholars and others to use this software to go further than we have and get better and more accurate results than we have, because we think the biblical studies field is behind where it needs to be in terms of adopting technology.
Yeah, and we're completely open to the idea that we might be wrong. I would assume that my assumption is that we might be wrong on a few things, like small tweaks, but there are some things that pretty heavily suggest that it's pretty solid. We ran the analysis in the Greek, but that Luke-Marcion connection is actually found not only in the Greek, but that split between Marcion's Evangeline and the rest of Luke in Acts and everything is not only found in Greek, but it's found in the Vulgate. And if you run it in English in the King James Version, it's still there. It's definitely not from one person. It's definitely something that utilized Evangeline. So Luke and Acts are absolutely second century documents. I mean, that is a hill that I will absolutely die on. It doesn't make any sense to not be. I'm very sure of it. Absolutely.
Okay. Next is from Ashlyn Cox, who asks, how do you account for change in writing styles from an individual over time? I feel like this is a huge variable that can't be accounted for.
Is that a me question, or do you want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, it can be. You're the one who ran the test on it. I can answer it, but it's up to you.
You go ahead and answer. I'm typing up some more names in the chat.
Oh, okay,
people are interested.
So we did actually run known authors over a 50-year point of time, and it came up with over 90% accuracy for over 50 years. We were able to determine that Stylometry was able to determine that determine the correct authorship for these particular texts. Paul in specific is usually who people point to because, of course, writes multiple things within, or is said to write multiple things within the New Testament. However, in that particular case, he writes from roughly, I guess, 48 to about 62, 63-ish. So not even 20 years, about 15 years or so. So no, it doesn't play in as much as people would, I guess, think it would, or historicists would like for it to. It just definitely doesn't play in that much. Now, another point that people tend to point up or bring up is what if theme or genre would play into it? Like this particular letter is written for this purpose. This is written to this purpose, or for this purpose, or to different people, or something like that. Could that come up? Short answer is no. We only really see using stylometry genre if you have just an absolute ton of different files in the run. Then you might see a little resemblance of genre or theme, but with the amount of data that we're using from the New Testament, it's definitely finding authorship, and it finds it very, very well. We actually run it on ourselves, believe it or not. In the book, we actually have a graph that actually splits out exactly what chapters we worked on. And there was a chapter in specific that we worked about half and half on, and it comes up right there in the middle. And then it puts all the chapters from Matthew in one section and the chapters from me in another section. So yeah, I mean, it's very scary accurate.
Okay. What about, because I know that there's some cases where Paul dictated, to somebody to write it down. I'm not sure if that occurs in the pastorals or if that's in the actual the ones that are generally considered to be genuine Pauline epistles. But would it account for that? Like, would it be able to pick up like it being dictated, like it was, these ideas were Paul's, but they were dictated by somebody else?
Matthew, if you wanted to tackle that, or are you still busy?
Yeah. Well, I was hosting stuff, but so yeah, that's actually as much as we don't always agree with Bart Ehrman, he more or less takes down that argument very extensively in his forgery and counter forgery, in that he doesn't take it down from a stylometric point of view, but basically that like there isn't evidence that it would show up to the degree of like different authors, and we find that too. Like there are people who have said, like I think Jaron mentioned Seneca or somebody, that outright says he uses scribes to more or less just write what they want under his name in one or two occasions, and we're able to see when that happens versus like when just scribes were used, and really it doesn't line up with what you would think. Like, for example, Timothy is mentioned as a co-author in a lot of them, but you don't see those Timothy letters line up, like not First Timothy and Second Timothy, but the ones he supposedly wrote show up differently from non-Timothy letters. Like it's not it's not in the same pattern. Like we can see patterns, but that's not one of the patterns.
Yeah.
And also, Timothy is very likely had been added in later versions of the letters. The first versions of the letters, according at least to Marcus Vincent, most of them did not have the mention of Timothy, because Timothy gets added in more depth when the pastoral layer comes about, because they wrote to Timothy and then they edited back those other texts to say like, oh, look, he was there all the time. And he is mentioned like in other things, but he's not a co-author. And at least in Marcus Vincent's reconstructions of these, which you can find on the Harvard Dataverse if you're interested in getting those texts.
Okay. I just want to say thank you guys for kind of running the gambit on all these questions and everything like that.
Yeah.
This next one's really personal though. I just have to say, like for Jaron, that cowboy hat CGI.
There are times that I have to remove it and show that yes, it actually is a real hat. It is. Yeah. I don't know why. I think the first video that I ever made on our TikTok, I was wearing a cowboy hat, and Matthew was like, "Hey, you should go ahead and just keep that hat on." And I don't know if that's him saying that it looks good or the top of my head looks ridiculous. But either way, I decided to go ahead and keep it. So yeah.
All right. And then we've got a super chat from Jesus Tales, who asks, where does Mark fit in with Luke and Proto Luke Marcion?
A good question.
Very good question.
Yeah. So we originally thought there was a Proto Mark. We actually spent a lot of time reconstructing what Proto Mark would look like, and that was
a very long amount of time.
Yes. And then so we finally got our reconstruction done, and then we ran them side by side in Stylo. And it turns out that what we thought would have been in Proto Mark and what was like added later in our theory there, they matched up as the same author. So there clearly was probably an earlier version of Mark, because as we found, like, and as all scholars know, the ending of Mark in Mark 16 was not original to the text, but there wasn't some like Proto Mark that we thought there was there. So our current working theory, and we're still working out the details, is that Marcion's text of his gospel was probably the first one, and that's what kicked off this gospel boom. That's why all the gospels get attested to around the same time, and why they're not named until like the 170s, 180s,
and why their responses or indirectly or directly something that connect to them.
Right. And there are problems as to like, why is Mark smaller than Luke, but it's not too much smaller than Marcion's gospel would have been, because you take out like 4 or 5 chapters worth of content that really trims down Luke. But the writing in Mark, if you look at it in the Greek, is very poor. Every sentence starts with "and," pretty much. Nearly every sentence starts with the word "k," which is the K-A-I is what it looks like in Greek. And it looks, the way we've heard some scholars describe it is, it looks like it was like second language writing. So we think maybe it was like a notes version. Marcus Vincent thinks that Marcion's gospel was actually stolen, or like somebody lifted from it and then probably wrote something like Mark. And that's why he publishes in 144 around the time he gets kicked out. And that's kind of where we're at on this question.
It's also very possible that Mark was like almost like a play version of the gospel stories, like for the initiates into the religion or the cult. Because with everything starting like and it's almost like then this happens and this happens. It's almost like a play.
Yeah, there's a sense of urgency.
Yeah. And now it also ends on a cliffhanger and everything, and it's like, oh well, you gotta be baptized and take the Lord's Supper if you want to find out more. Like tune in next week. But yeah, again, the concept of this gospel being something that was just kind of being presented as a form of the gospel according to Mark Keon, which is how his name was actually pronounced back then, which just meant little Mark. It just kind of makes a little bit more sense.
Okay. Let's see. There's that. And then, crap. I was gonna show Matthew's list of authors.
There's 2 now.
Yeah. I was gonna No, you're fine. Let's see. There's this one, some other authors y'all might be interested in. Thomas Brody, all of them. In general, the Dutch radical school of thought, I guess. Let's see. There's that list, and
There was
I
one
know
before, yeah.
I'm getting to it. Sorry. Here you go.
Okay.
There you go. And so those are. Would you say that these are the scholars that you're kind of basing your conclusions on?
Right.
A
Yes.
lot of
So
it.
we don't. Yeah, we don't just like make stuff up. After we saw these results, what we did is we did an extensive like review of the literature and try to find, did any scholars have theories like what we found in our results? And so these are the scholars that like more or less came to similar conclusions using just textual analysis and things like that. So really we all our stuff, it's not like original. The only original thing we really contribute is that we're running this text or these texts at a smaller level in terms of analysis, and we're bringing this analysis to like a more, I guess, like modern approach where you can do it really fast.
Yeah.
The theories are largely not ours. We're combining the work of many scholars over the last 200 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
And more or less solidifying it. I mean, I think one of the biggest arguments against when people say, oh, hey, you're using stilometry wrong, it's like, well, we do line up with scholars, not just on some of the old ideas, like say F.C. Bauer in the 1800s. He was in the 1800s, I believe, where he says that, Paul wrote just 4 books. Like we're seeing a lot of that too. But also things like, obviously scholars today, they say, hey, whoever wrote Luke wrote Acts. It's like, well, we see a little better version of that. We see a clearer version of what in Luke was written by that person. But all of Acts comes up as one author. And, all of it comes up as one author. And it's the same author who wrote the first 3.5 chapters of Luke and the first 1 or 2 chapters at the end, or the last 1 or 2 chapters at the end, And so, it comes up together. So there's times in specific where we line up with what scholars say. So we wouldn't get those results if we were running it weird or running it wrong. It shouldn't come up. You'd have to explain why it says the same thing that scholars say today or have said in the past. You'd have to explain that.
Right. We do have one other question coming in from Ashland Cox, who asks, did they calibrate with a combination of internal evidence, external comparisons, and cross-disciplinary data?
Yeah. So I think that's kind of like what we were saying. We didn't just make stuff up. We're not coming up with our own theories here. We are presenting what matches the data the most from other scholars. So we do use textual arguments for the Mark 13 thing. For example, like we said, Mark 13 shows up as a different author. That threw problems out because then why would it be a different author than the rest of the gospel? How does that work with the dating of 70? So then we look to the works of Herman Dietering, for example, and we see that Herman Dietering made an extensive case just based on textual analysis that Mark 13 is actually probably talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt. Same thing with the Luke stuff. We see that the first 3 chapters of Luke stylometrically show up differently than the rest of the text. So we have a claim in history from early church fathers and the opposition that it was either added to or it was cut back from a heretical group. And then we see in the text that it's out of order. And the order that it would have been correct where Jesus, because in the current version, you can go look at in Luke 4 that they're talking about Jesus doing miracles in Capernaum when he's never been there. In the original version of Marcion's in the 140s, that verse was reversed, and they point that out. Multiple scholars have noticed that, and even in the 200s, Tertullian was pointing out that in Marcion's version, Jesus just descends from the sky because he's a demigod and blah, 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 and he's attacking him. But, we cross-reference all this stuff. We looked at other scholars' data like Jacques Savoy. There are some others that have run stuff on this, but like we were saying, it's largely the chapter level that we make this contribution.
Yeah. And that verse 23 in Luke 4 is my favorite part of Luke now, because it's very clearly showing that had to be connected to Marcion's Evangeline in some particular way, because that line is not in Mark. It's not in Matthew. It's not in John. It's not in any other gospel. It's just found in Evangeline and Luke. And so one of those had to come first, and it's probably the one that actually gets it right. It's actually in order.
Okay. Well, I've sufficiently taken up y'all Saturday night. I appreciate you coming on and everything. And while I'm not convinced of y'all's particular way of getting to mythicism, I hope that people, can give you, their time and attention to listen to your case. Like y'all have established, there are some scholars out there that are supporting this position. And I do agree that it's rather hard to solidly date Paul, but I feel like I still have a feeling that there's a less chance of him being dated to the 2nd century. But, I'm not an expert. So I just go by, what experts say and everything like that. So I'm still trying to suss out the finer points of all of this kind of conversation. But again, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and everything like that. I'm going to keep listening to y'all's book. And, is there anything else that y'all would like to say before we head out?
I'd like to just make sure that I understand where you're coming from here. That ultimately you agree with our conclusion that Jesus doesn't exist, but just not our methodology of getting there. Obviously, as a mythicist yourself, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily that you don't think that our methods of putting things in the 2nd century is necessarily problematic. You just don't see how that jumps to your conclusion. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I do find issues with placing the Gospels and Paul in the 2nd century, and especially saying that Paul didn't exist. It's kind of one of those situations where it's like I've thought about questioning Paul's historicity, but like the arguments for a historical Paul are at least solid enough to to point towards a historical Paul for me. So I mean, like, while I do have issues with y'all placing like the Gospels and everything in the 2nd century, I'm always leaving myself open to new information and new ideas and where those things can lead. Because I'm thinking about my how I came to the mythicist position. 800 years ago or so, people were in the same position about the historicity of Moses and all of them.
Yeah.
And so I try to remain open to new information, but I'm very guarded in accepting new positions until I feel sufficiently convinced. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Would most of what it would take to bring you over to our side be an understanding of what parts of the historical Paul found within the epistles are forgeries and what parts are not?
Well, I guess as far as that goes, I'm not exactly convinced on the reliability of the analysis of the text. I'm not saying that y'all have done anything wrong necessarily with the application of it. I guess I'm just I'm just a little unsure about how that actually factors into the conclusion. Because, typically mainstream scholars, there's nuanced and complicated positions on, what has been interpolated into Paul, what's been changed into Paul. And then there's also the curious issue with, there not being like solid manuscript evidence prior to the 300s. Like we don't have a full and complete manuscript until the 4th century. And so like it kind of becomes a question of what was changed, what is original, what was really there. And so it's kind of like one of those, I feel like, unanswerable questions. And I guess I'm just leaving myself open to there being other possibilities as to why some of these things could be different and why Paul could be writing in different ways at certain times or whatnot, how all of that could have, progressed. So I guess it's more about me not jumping to a conclusion based on this information, and shucking the, what's been established for a while. I'm not trying to play at a ad populum argument or anything. I'm just saying that, like, I would need to see a bit more sufficient evidence than just a stylistic analysis of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, makes sense. We'll get you over here. Baby steps.
Yeah. Well, I definitely, I definitely agree that having these types of radical ideas in the, I guess, the community definitely spurs a lot of deeper thinking on these subjects. Like, for instance, as soon as I started looking into, like, the historicity of Paul, why do we think Paul wrote, these particular epistles rather than the others, and like what places Paul in the 50s and everything like that, I had no idea that of how hard it was to actually put Paul at a specific time and place. And while
Right.
I tend to agree more with the conclusions of, like, either 50 BCE or 50 CE for his writings and everything like that, I'm not the type of person to just outright discount everything, like, outside of that. I'm definitely willing to be convinced. I would just need to see more evidence and data analyzing this, and more convincingly, I guess, place Paul in the 2nd century and as a fictional person, rather than just solely sort of relying on this stylistic approach.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like you're both like, oh, you're crazy.
Oh, no.
no.
We get.
I think it's only natural to be really apprehensive when it comes to these things, because when spilometry is being used on these different chapters and we see the results, I mean, when we first saw it, we didn't know what to think. There were times where literally at like 10:30 or 11 at night, Matthew would call me up and be like, what the hell is happening? Like, what am I looking at here? Like, what is this? And there were times that, if you read our book, the first 6 chapters don't really talk too much about spilometry really at all. And then finally we get into that around chapter 7 and chapter 8. But I guess there were times that initially, before we ran spilometry on the text, that we had ideas that ended up just, we had to change. We had to figure out why we see something kind of result, and in some cases just completely abandon certain ideas. And today we're still doing that with Proto-Mark and everything. We were convinced Christ Before Jesus, our book, I've got a copy of it here somewhere. There we go. It has parts in it where we talk about how Proto-Mark existed. And we are having to put into more or less this little 2nd edition, so to speak. We're having to update the text here in the coming weeks to say that we're wrong on that. We're wrong on that because there is no stylometric proof that this thing actually existed. And we just kind of, we assumed that it was correct. We went with more or less kind of a compromise with some other scholars who had kind of postulated it to be a potential document out there that was floating around prior to Marcion. And we reconstructed it using the same or methods that, say, Mark Bilby would be using. I'm pretty sure it's using the same method. We just didn't find it. And, at the end of the day, the results are the results. And we can't, we don't want to go against them. We're not going to say, oh, hey, well, these results are just wrong. Sorry.
Yeah. We just
but it is something that's very shocking when you first see them. Yeah. So we completely understand. So we don't think you're crazy. I think it's just a matter of like, hey, look, this is making me think of something in a completely different way than how I've been thinking about it before. So it's only natural to be like, I'm a little timid.
Yeah, I mean, I was apprehensive about, becoming a mythicist too, until I like really grasped, all of the arguments and evidence for the position that I currently have. And I'm still pretty well convinced by that, because I feel like it definitely answers like a whole swath of questions that people could levy my direction. And I do want to ask something that my wife asked in chat about peer review, and I'm just wondering, have you ever considered trying to get a version of your argument like peer reviewed by a journal anywhere?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot. I honestly, just a matter of, I have multiple jobs. Jaren's got like a really busy full-time job, and so like it was like an act of God to get this book out. So,
Yeah.
but yeah. So like we do, but honestly, we know that even if we did that, we feel like people are going to move the goalposts again and say, well, what journal was it in? And then they're going to ask, well, what credentials do you have to do this? And then they're going to ask, well, this, and so, and that's just the fact that whenever you disagree with like, what is commonly accepted, you're going to get that kind of stuff. Richard
Yeah.
Carrier gets it all the time. He's like, oh, I've seen people say, oh, he doesn't have a teaching position, so you can't take anything he says seriously. The goalposts move, and that's not to discredit peer review or the possibility of us getting peer review or anything like that. It's just, it's lower on our list. That's why we put in the book, like, hey, please try this yourself. We could be wrong. We want people who have more credentials and will be more believed to take this and run with it, because we think we found something and we really want people to do scholarship on it. So
The amount of times that I've seen literal archaeologists tell me that dinosaurs exist, to call back to what I said earlier, it doesn't change the minds of some people who just have to see the bones for themselves. And that's the type of people who we wanted to get this stuff out to. And we understand that we are not scholars. We never claim to be. And until Matthew decides to go and get his PhD somewhere, which I'm not necessarily pushing him to do. He can do whatever. We're not going to be scholars. That we don't claim to be that. But we're just trying to get the conversation going. And if people pick up on this and more scholarly work is done and peer review studies come out, that's perfectly fine. We do acknowledge that we're in the fringe. We do acknowledge that, however, that we're on the front of a wave that we feel like is coming. But, that's just kind of how it goes.
Consensus changes over time, and that's how it's supposed to be. And, hopefully it'll, we're right. And if not, then that's okay. We tried, and we really are trying to get the conversation going, like Jaren said. And yeah, we really appreciate you having us on here too, by the way. It's been a fun conversation.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I've had fun with it too, and like I said, in prepping for our discussion and everything like that, and kind of looking at the arguments for mainstream stuff and everything, like I learned a lot, and so like I hope that people, one way or another, try to learn from like our discussion here, but also your efforts just in general, learning more about the scholarship and everything along those lines, because I mean you guys do have some scholarship to place your theory on, so I mean I just hope that people come away learning something more about like the history of Christianity and everything like that. But anyways, thank you guys for coming on and everything. Really appreciate it. I got the book linked in the description if this resonates with anybody and you want to go and check out what they have to say in the book. I've got the book on Audible. I'm going to be listening to it and everything like that. And so I hope that y'all will maybe listen to it too if you want to. But in any case, thank you, Jaren and Matthew. Did I get that? I got it right. I'm getting it right.
Jaren, yes.
Jaren, fuck me.
Oh man.
Yeah, I thought I was so good, honey. I thought I was so good.
Yeah, it was close. I answer to Jaren, J-Ron, Jerome, hey you.
Hey you.
Doesn't matter.
Thank you guys for coming in tonight. I really appreciate it. And I guess I will be seeing you guys over there on TikTok.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you
again.
Thank you very much.
Right. Bye, everybody. I hope you will stand up and use your voice.